I hope I'm up to this task. I didn't realize until after we had finished preparing the guidelines of what they were all about, and I'm still not complete on that. I want to spend most of the time on my opinions about, on a perspective about the Canadian guidelines, and not spend too much time on the content, because the content is freely available and you can read it if you want it. I want to tell a little bit about how these were conceived and the process of how they were prepared. And then after having worked with them for a number of years, of what differences I found in my own practice, in comparing the Canadian guidelines, which I've been using for quite a while, even before they were published, because I had access to them, and the ones that were available before. So basically, I'll start with how these were conceived. There was a charity-like organization in Canada called MEFM Action Network, which sent a survey to practitioners, primary practitioners in Canada, and to see what they wanted to learn, to how they wanted to, what sort of document they would want to help their practice in dealing with these patients of MEFM. So this process included the entity of fibromyalgia, which is not included in our discussion, but also ME and CFS, which is the American title for the condition. I did a process for both of them at the same time. It was sort of the emphasis was on clinical expertise. It went through a stakeholder process through Health Canada, the government agency, and we included, I think, 5 or 6 different stakeholders that were had to have input into the nominations of the committee members, and these included clinicians and researchers and university people, government people, and industry people. And the nominations were done through this procedure. Then we developed a committee of about 12 people who went through the process of doing a modified Delphi process, in which versions of a document were put out to these people. They would come back with all sorts of criticisms, and then go back and forth at least 5 or 6 times in a lengthy process. And in the course of this whole thing, the consensus of some sort was achieved, because everybody agreed on the final document and signed it, so that there was an implicit consensus, not in all the details, of course, because 12 clinicians, you can't get them to agree about anything in great detail. But a general consensus was available, and it was published in 2003, and it's available to everyone who wants to have a look at it. My reflections, which are not part of the consensus, of course, is after having used this material for a number of years, and what difference it made to my practice, which is, I'm an internal medicine person and have an active practice right now, primarily with chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, and fibromyalgia. And I did find that it made a tremendous difference to how I approached patients. Before I get into the details on this, I want to introduce you to a mentor who I got to know thinking about the process. And I want to orient you in this, in a view of London. I think that if I'm right, we are right about here in this venue. This is taken from Pall Mall. Probably Piccadilly, a view of Pall Mall, and The Westminster Abbey is the big structure in the middle here. This is St. James Palace, and this is Pall Mall, the road here. I think it's taken from Piccadilly, and I think we should be somewhere between Piccadilly and Westminster Abbey in this venue here. So I want to get you oriented here so that you can get a here and now experience of where you are, but shift you back in time 350 years to the London of Thomas Sydenham in 1660, which was an active time. The 1660 is the year of where the Royal Society was produced. There was a very active scientific research climate just developing. They had just finished their religious wars, and they were getting on to some more serious business. And Thomas Sydenham was a physician of that period who had fought in the Civil War and settled down into practice in Westminster. And had a house on Pall Mall, was 200 meters from that diagram. He had developed a busy practice, which he estimated about 2/3 fevers, 1/3 other things. Half of that 1/3 was what he called hysteria and hypochondriasis, and the other half was incidentals, including his own illness, which he suffered from for about 30 years, which was gout. And in the course of this, he developed friendships with members of the Royal Society. He was quite a good friend of Robert Boyle, and he had an apprentice physician by the name of John Locke, who he developed a good relationship with. And he was quite independent of all this furor of experimental science which was developing at the time, decided that this wasn't worth very much, and that he would go back to Hippocrates and use his clinical experience of patients to develop what he called disease descriptions. These were somewhere between case descriptions and generic descriptions of disease. These were specific, and he developed a way of talking about it in a very classically adequate way to develop classic descriptions of many diseases, which are still very familiar to a clinician in terms of their accuracy and adequacy, not in terms of what he felt about how to treat them and what their causes were, because he was back into the humoral doctrines of Hippocrates. But he was an excellent clinician and consciously stayed away from science, which he felt was the hypotheses which are necessary for the development of scientific experiments were sometimes intrusive on people's attitudes, and he wanted to get some very empirical descriptions of clinical cases, not the anatomy, not the biochemistry, not the biophysics, which was developing, but just clinical case descriptions. He induced John Locke, who was studying iatrochemistry in Oxford at that time, to join him in his clinical experience and leaving this chemical studies. So he had a very independent mind and developed these very classical descriptions of disease. Now I want you to do a thought experiment, putting yourself 350 years ahead now, in a way that, and compare what we are doing now with what we observe Thomas Sydenham to have done. That is, he had all sorts of theories which were based on Hippocratic humoral theory, and which are not regarded in good favor now. He had a lot of remedies that he used, and most of which are not in good favor right now. What he did have that has lasted and is still perfectly relevant right now are his clinical case descriptions, his clinical disease descriptions, which are a step above the case descriptions which are of individual patients. However, these the descriptions of Thomas Sydenham are so familiar. I mean, you read these descriptions and you recognize the patient's illnesses and diseases and struggles. And I felt that unbeknownst to myself, that this was Sydenham's attitude of doing very careful case or disease descriptions, is what he called, holding the entity, the clinical entity, in its grasp, and then allowing the research to unfold, as it will, over the years, and eventually somebody will find the cause. Now, in his case, his illness was gout. He suffered it, and he had patients who suffered it. And he gave very, very adequate descriptions of gout. And he held that clinical concept open for 350 years, so about 300 years, until the researcher could come to the proper experiments to discover the mechanism of gout, which is a form of acute arthritis, and it's a form of crystal arthritis, which was first delineated in 1961. This did not mean that the gout was not treated as a clinical entity through all these years, and that the development of adequate treatments and adequate procedures to handle it, they went on. But I think because of these very adequate clinical concepts, very clear, which have been steady and active in informing and orienting clinical activity from Sydenham's time until the present. So I want to then go back to the clinical case definition that we have defined in the Canadian criteria. The clinical case definitions prior have been research definitions, and they were used to inform the research process, in which case the patients had criteria to hold so that they could form distinct groups and comparable groups and so on, and have comparisons across different areas of the country and the world, so they had comparable patients. And this was a great thing to do. And they were able to generate a lot of clinical research doing this. However, this research wasn't getting used. The results of the research were not getting used and incorporated into further definitions because they stayed the same research definitions. So the Canadian clinical definitions, which were produced by clinicians, were tried to incorporate this research that was available starting in 1998 into the definition, so that it would be helpful for clinicians to interpret the experience of their patients in a way that would make sense. If you have a list of symptoms, for example, like a laundry list, which hasn't any coherence to it, it's not very much help. It overloads doctors. They have a limit, an informal limit, to say, we can handle 5 symptoms, but more than that, it's impossible, and we'll throw you out the door. Because these symptoms don't make medical sense. They're just a list. A laundry list gives you the order in which you put your clothes on, but nothing else. And so we wanted to get a symptom list with an order that would reflect the clinical research that had been done so far. And it seemed to amount to regions, what we call regions of dysfunction. That is, not specific symptoms, but a whole set of symptoms that were possibly reflections of an abnormal physiology in a certain region of the organism. And these seem to devolve into the sections that we studied in the definition of the case definition, which included, first of all, fatigue, which has been the defining symptom for chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, a syndrome is not a symptom. It is a set of symptoms, and this is forgotten often. And a symptom list, including fatigue, is impossibly long and heterogeneous. Even if you put the dynamic considerations that have been in other definitions, but we certainly made criteria for our definition, which was the fatigue had delayed reactive features to it, which separated off from ordinary fatigue, a physiological fatigue, and made it distinctive. This was not sufficient to form a syndrome. The next component we had was a sleep dysfunction. We didn't specify which one, but it was a number of them that were possibly an individual expression of these, a number of them. And then pain, and then some neurological cognitive dysfunctions, which ended up with a huge list because people's brains are unique, and they produce dysfunction in a unique way, and they develop unique symptoms. But notice that all these symptoms are expressions from disturbances of the central nervous system. And then we added another one from the from the peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and also two appendages of the nervous system, probably the endocrine system and the immune system. Now, there will be disagreement here, but all of these things are interconnected. All these systems are interconnected and form part of the control systems of the body. That is, the parts of the body that move and change in order for the rest of it to stay the same. So these are immensely complex systems that are changing all the time, and they're all interconnected and forming some of the most complex systems in the universe, probably, and it's very hard to study. And I think that in many ways that the illness is an expression of these disturbances in these areas, and also the reactions to them from the psychosocial context. Now, this has caused a huge problem because with some of the models of the psychosocial, biopsychosocial models available, there's not a good distinction between risk factors, aggravating factors, parts of the context of an illness versus the illness itself. And so one of the major things that we wanted to do with this Canadian definition was to hold the entity status of ME/CFS, that it was a thing and it had a context, and that by holding this entity status in the same way that Sydenham had held the entity status of gout with his clear clinical descriptions, we would do the same thing, to get a definition which encouraged physicians to get close enough to the experience that the patients were having to have some informed empathy for their state, and that they had enough distance to make it into not just a repetition of their symptoms, but to give some distance into understanding of what the pathophysiology might be, and at least the regions of pathogenesis where the disturbances might be. So this is really what I hope that the clinical definitions accomplished in the Canadian definitions here. They're clinical definitions. They're not research definitions. They are giving enough sufficient clinical material in a coherent way, and also to encourage the patient to do the clinical skills necessary, even though we don't know what the cause is. Now, I think that this talk will be available. I'm going to skip around a little bit because there's much more material than I can talk about. It will be available for people in some sort of format to study it further if they wish to. But I'm going to skip around a little bit. We've talked about these things already. Now, we also mentioned the regions of dysfunction, which are necessary for the definition, but also have a contingent aspect to it because there's choice within each region to have symptoms. You don't have to have a specified symptom, an exact symptom. You can have a choice between a different, within a set of symptoms, so that this allowed for individual variation in such massively complex systems that we've talked about. Now, this approach facilitates individual diagnosis. It's designed for the individual patient and not the patient as a member of a set, which is the distinction I use between clinical activity and scientific activity. That is, in science, you are always regarding a person as a member of a set of some sort. And in clinical medicine, ideally, you are regarding a person as an individual, which means etymologically, it means undivided, indivisible. So that is a sort of a holistic approach. The patient presents themselves to a clinician tries to sort out what is relevant, what is irrelevant, what forms parts of a syndrome, which is a syndrome means a set of symptoms that are running together from the Greek origin. Syn and then drome is like a hippodrome, a running course. And these symptoms are running together. And this, in other words, they form a coherence and a consilience, which means they have a timing association, so that they are running together in space and time. And one of the biggest issues as a clinician is to sort out a set of symptoms into a group of symptoms which show consilience and coherence, forming a syndrome. In a sense, an individual syndrome, because the patient has a set of symptoms that come together and work together and interact with each other, and they also will have symptoms often which have nothing to do with it, have a different pathogenesis. So that the clue that you get from a clinician, from a patient by a clinician, is the fact that these symptoms are coming into, they have a single or related pathogenesis. And this is very important in terms of not just giving the patient a label. It is trying to say what is actually going on in this patient. And if you can get the coherent entities together, and then you can start getting the patient to look at these symptoms, also see what their interconnections are with both with outer activity and other inner activities. And then you can carry on in a self-healing approach if you pay attention to these symptoms and their significance and the fact that they're coming together in a syndrome. Now, this is the most essential clinical practice that we've talked about, is diagnosis in a way not just of naming the patient, the name of the symptom or the disease or condition that the patient has, but what is it that's going on in this particular patient that's making them ill? This sort of goes beyond labeling and into what you're trying to you're seeing in the patient. It goes connected to a distinctively clinical discipline, which is a second-person discipline, because most of this information comes from talking to a patient as a clinician in a very trained way, but it's a second person, not a third person or a first person way of observing a patient. Now, because of this type of relationship, clinical relationship, then one can go on to estimating severity, disability in the individual patient. Now, this is not done from a scientific point of view. It's done from the individual point of view, and it has to do with different words. Like disability means lack of ability, disability. And the patient's ability lies within, in respect to their life world, not with respect to some measured universal standards. It's within their life world, within their consciousness that you do this. And then the next very important estimate that you have to do clinically is to estimate an individual prognosis. This is not the prognosis of a set of individuals averaging things out, but a prognosis which follows the course of the illness in a very exact way, a very exacting way, in a very Hippocratic way, to estimate what the course of the illness is, and also to be more accurate and clear about what the effects of your remedies are, your treatments, because they impact on the symptom level, and the patient has to feel the difference in the symptoms. So this is why they have to be accurate about this. The other aspects of clinical medicine are the decision regarding treatment and the estimate of its effects in an ongoing fashion, and the search for preventive strategies. Now, if you have, what I mean by preventive strategies means that how can you prevent your symptoms? Can you alter the activities of your daily life, alter your intake of medication or food or exercise quality or whatever, to change the symptom level to one that's lower? And that's self-treatment. It's a very obvious thing to do. But it depends on this connection between a clinician and a patient so that they can organize their symptoms to know which ones are the exact that come from the body. They're not sort of imposed on them from other material, conceptual material, and also what they've read about, what their memories are, so on. So you have to develop a here and now consciousness with the patient that says, what are these symptoms? What is the body signals? What are they telling them? And so to change their activities. And they learn to do this. It's particularly difficult with ME patients because of the delayed reactive features to both their fatigue and their pain. Because ordinarily, we have no problem with finding the cause of fatigue. I mean, we've done something, we get fatigued, and there's a connection and a sort of an informal life world kind of causal context. You rest and you get better. Now, if the fatigue gets displaced, like for many different possible reasons, but it becomes the next day or the 2 days later, and you have to look back on what you were doing 2 or 3 days ago that took you beyond a crash boundary, which is, again, part of the patient language which they develop for severe episodes of fatigue. So they have to develop a much finer-tuned sense of what their symptoms are and their significance. And once they get to know these things, they get a tremendous amount of control over their activities. They feel more control over their illness, and they don't have to rely so much on medication, say for pain relief or fatigue relief, because they know what to do. And this is a tremendous source of significance and power for the patient. So these are the clinical aspects of clinical medicine, which are not that a research definition is not interested in particular, unless they're doing specific interests in that particular treatment, etc. And they don't get this relationship going between a physician or any therapist and the patient in terms of trying to get these the disability, the prognosis, the effects of treatment, and the preventive strategies. Now, going back to the Canadian protocol, with the combination of these necessary and optional features, which we talked about, the definition allows the diagnosis to fit the patient within limits, rather than the other way around, in the way of Procrustes, which fitted the patient to the diagnosis. This guides the process of diagnosis wherein the physician listens to the presentation of an individual, undivided, whole being, patient's symptoms, and elicits his signs in a dynamic and interrelated entity, a syndrome, not just a collection of symptoms, which I would call a conglomeration, which is very different. It has no sense to it. It is this special kind of listening and observation within a balanced second and third person ontology, I don't want to go into all this philosophical jargon, that allows a patient to present his symptoms as an entity standing out against a background, so that there's a clarity of their particular clinical situation, that there's an entity, whether this be objective or subjective, or the usual mixture of the two of them, but it is an entity, not a non-entity, that's standing out, that they're dealing with, orients their efforts, and everybody else's efforts, and it's against a background, which every illness has, a psychosocial background, but biological background too, as more and more less and less relevant things that are going on in the environment. So because you're working with a unique patient, you have an inbuilt relevance to this. The patient presents their symptoms plus all these other relevances, and you can then sort of get an estimate of the patient's entity, illness entity, plus the background from the clinical definitions, not the research one. And then this, of course, this sort of thing gets muddled, as is usual, because everybody's trying to turn everything into a third-person mode, because there's a sort of a natural distrust of subjectivity and the sort of second-person relationships in our society, because we've had 100 years of behaviorism. So symptoms are distrusted, and this reliance on symptoms, which is very unique to clinical activity, becomes problematic. Now, what does the entity focus mean? It's that not only leads to a naming of a syndrome, like if you have ME or you have chronic fatigue syndrome or whatever, but also observing its dynamic causal impact on the patient's life, the degree of dis-ease, in that word not used in the usual fashion, but moving away from the state of ease. In other words, how severe your symptoms are, basically. And disability, again, not in the usual way talking about disability, but away from your abilities, moving away from your abilities, that the patient has as a precise observation of the course of illness on which depends the estimates of prognosis, treatment response, and the effect of secondary preventive measures depend on this clarity and precision, which is not a quantified, third-person quantification process, but something that's done within the life world of the patient. Now, it's only when these observations are made within the second-person mode of a doctor-patient relationship, any therapist-patient relationship, one can begin to clarify the contribution of the illness entity, the thing itself that we're dealing with, versus the contribution of its contextual background variables, which receives a lot of attention these days with the biopsychosocial model. This includes its biological and psychosocial surroundings, causing the dis-ease and disability. And it can and does become confused if one does not have a clear clinical process leading to a clear clinical entity to provide focus to itself and to its relevant versus irrelevant background factors. And it's to identify this and clarify this process that I think that the Canadian clinical definitions were not oriented in this way. We found out afterwards that they worked this way, that they were developed, not with that intention, but with that result. I can get into all these different things. I want to make some mention of what I would call non-entity diagnoses, that these are diagnoses which are deconstructive and end up with an absence of a clinical entity. And I think that these belong to a family. They would start with somatoform disorders, which means that a symptom is being simulated but doesn't have any biochemical background. And then it goes on into factitious disorders and malingering, which are more and more simulating diseases, where symptoms don't come from the body, they come from the mind, and are a construction. And trying to sort out all these differences is very difficult. There are, which I don't want to get into because we don't have time. There's also a move from more speciated diagnoses to more generic diagnoses, such as the move from fibromyalgia, which is a fairly speciated chronic form of chronic pain, to one such as chronic pain syndrome, which is a one-symptom syndrome, which means it isn't a syndrome. And you lose a lot of information, unique clinical information in that process of becoming more generic, and of smudging primary and secondary distinctions in diagnoses. That is, whether it's primary or secondary to something else, which is very important in the clinical causal context. It may not be important in terms of a general medical model, but in terms of clinical, deciding a patient whether their, say, depression is primary or secondary is an extremely important thing, or whether their pain is primary or secondary. Now, I want to spend a few minutes here going back to Sydenham. We talked mostly about him. I think he's responsible for all this. He's my mentor in all this. He gave us very clear clinical entities that he described many, many years ago, and they have done the test of time. They are still clear today as they were yesterday, even though a lot of this stuff was nonsense that we regard as nonsense now. So in some sense, I think the Canadian definition and the whole protocol is a way of generalizing Sydenham's methods. We are not one unique person, but we are encouraging a set of clinicians to develop clear, concise entity diagnoses so that we can be clear about what is going on in the illness process itself and what's going on in its context. Now, I was asked to talk about etiology for a bit. I will spend a half a minute saying it is very, very confused and confusing. I'll give you the metaphor of the blind man in the elephant. The 5 or 6 blind men feeling an elephant, blind men, saying that an elephant is this and that and the other thing and so on. And these are all partial results within a very complex system, as I explained. And I don't know when we're going to get to the end of it. These are very complex systems we're studying. This is distinct from the problem of finding a cause. I don't care how complex your illness is. If you can find a unique cause for the agent that is amenable to treatment, fine. If it's like complicated, like pernicious anemia, if you find B12, you can cure it. The illness is over. I don't care how complex it is. But if you don't have that unique causal agent, and there's a lot of argument about these, a lot of candidates available, you're stuck with this complexity. And that's where we are right now. Now, my conclusion is choose the right kind of entity, or you may end up only considering background factors with no clinical entity left that they are the background of. This is the fate of the Cheshire cat that lost its body while keeping its smile. That's the philosophy of that we're dealing with in a nutshell. You have the body connected to the smile, or you have the smile itself without a body. And these are the two alternatives that we're dealing with right now. It's a very confusing situation. And I think maybe the Cheshire cat has a better answer to it than I have.
Thank you, Bruce.
We're trying to simplify. I think we were talking about a complex issue, as I made clear, I hope. And so we have to deal with complex things. We're trying to simplify the guidelines by making a shorter version. I think they're available. The concision is also the problem. They're too simple. But we try to make a balance. My own sense is that it gets to be more easy and more efficient to diagnose these conditions once you get to know them. You don't have to go through all these big, long explorations of differential diagnosis, et cetera, of all the possibilities for fatigue that are existent. There are a huge number. And, ideally, you would have to go through all these different possibilities in each patient, but nobody has the time or patience for that. So basically what people have to ration their time, but they have to develop the awareness of special symptoms that are quite characteristic of ME, which, for example, cognitive fatigue. And you can often see this online as you're talking to a patient. When they get cognitive fatigue in the process of the interview, the cognitive fatigue as well as sensory problems, which are not fatigue but hypersensitization, and some motor problems which you can test for easily by using more advanced cerebellar testing that you can quantify in a way that shows their fatiguing nature, which is the critical thing. These are not like ordinary neurological entities, in my opinion, but they can be. But the significant symptom is one of fatiguing, that they start off doing fairly well. And then maybe 10 or 15 minutes into the interview, if they have that long an interview, they can't talk anymore. Or they're making huge mistakes, or they're blocking their thought trains and all this sort of thing that's going on. But a lot of doctors do not observe this because they are entity focused. I mean, they're static entity focused, not dynamic entity focused. And you have to have a dynamic approach to these conditions to see them in action. Because it's a fatigue. Fatigue is a dynamic process. You start fresh and you end up fatigued. And a lot of psychological testing has to do with entity focus. They throw away results that show evidence of fatigue because they're supposed to be fresh. The patients are supposed to be fresh when you do the examination. Therefore, if you do in a fatigue state, that's not the data has to be thrown away instead of used. So, but this is I try to talk to psychologists who are doing this, but it doesn't enter. But these are things that are available to somebody who knows the concept. And by these, hopefully, people will get intrigued enough about these. These are very, very intriguing clinical entities that we have before us. That's going on. The process is going on in front of us. And if we have the clinical astuteness and the sensitivity to these things, they'll be picked up much more efficiently than they are now. It takes an age.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring and good lecture, which gave inspiration to meet those bio-psycho social deconstructive approach. We have one problem with our colleagues. I'm from Bergen, Norway. I've been examining in Norway around 1,000 patients with ME. And in Norway, we are now in the process of giving the colleagues an introduction and instruction of how they should work with ME patients. And we have one question for you. The main new thing in your setup is to define this as a critical fatigue condition. I'm a clinical neurologist with MS patients and Parkinson patients. And the difference between neurology and ME is great, and ME is a loss of energy that is out of proportion compared to the other neurological conditions. And the question is, what will you suggest to have measurement on fatigue? Because those patients are not tired, they are lacking energy. And what would you suggest us to put into the text to measure fatigue?
So I tried to explain this as fatigue is something you feel with your consciousness. You don't sometimes, and sometimes fatigue is manifest in dysfunction. That is, you can't walk, for example, or you're getting clumsy, you're hitting into things. These are also manifestations of fatigue, but they're not felt as a quality, as a symptom. So it's impossible to quantify symptoms because they're qualia. They are things that are part of consciousness, and you can sort of set up types of numerical scale, but I don't trust them because they're going to vary between patient to patient. So I don't think there's a universal scale available in a VAT scale for fatigue. But I think that that really all depends on your knowledge of a clinician's knowledge of the patient and the patient's knowledge of themselves, whether they are fatigued or not. And this is a subjective decision, and it can be made more accurate with training and sort of getting into sort of the mindfulness, or what I call mindfulness, that you observe these things and don't get just upset about them when they're happening. And you observe them when they're getting better, when they're getting worse, and so on. You can be quite precise about getting fatigue getting better or getting worse, even though you can't put a figure to it. You could put a figure to it, say it's gone from 9 to 10 or 10 to 8 or something like that. But I think that's relatively arbitrary.